We have talked about the potential frontrunners for the 2024 Republican presidential nomination before. There's Donald J. Trump, of course, and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. But we need to talk about a man who isn't a leading GOP contender, but who is pouring all of his hypocrisy and cynicism and thirst into applying for the job he'll never have. That's right. We need to talk about Mike Pompeo, Donald Trump's former Secretary of State and former CIA director. Like so many Trump sycophants, he's on a rehabilitation tour, hawking a new memoir of his time in the last administration. It's in that memoir, we learn this week, that Pompeo tried to distinguish himself from the rest of the pack by almost justifying the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the US-based Saudi dissident and Washington Post columnist, who was murdered, of course, by thugs doing the bidding of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. As NBC News reports, Pompeo writes in his book that Khashoggi, quote, didn't deserve to die, but we need to be clear about who he was, and too many in the media were not. Pompeo then mocks the media for portraying him as a Saudi Arabian Bob Woodward who was martyred for bravely criticizing the Saudi royal family through his opinion articles in the Washington Post. Khashoggi was, in Pompeo's telling, merely an activist and only a journalist, quote, to the extent that I and many other public figures are journalists. We sometimes get our writing published, but we also do other things. To cap things off, Pompeo also wrote that Khashoggi was cozy with the terrorist-supporting Muslim Brotherhood. Khashoggi's widow told NBC News that he was never part of the Muslim Brotherhood, adding that Pompeo, quote, should be silent and shut up the lies about my husband. On the one hand, how very on brand for a conservative Republican to argue that a non-white man killed by state authorities was no angel. On the other hand, it's a disgusting and inexcusable thing to say, even by the standards of former Trump people. And in fact, especially by the standards of America's former top diplomat, the person who is supposed to export American values abroad. Mike Pompeo considers himself a Christian. I must have missed a part in the Bible that says, thou shalt not kill, but if a strategic ally murders a dissident you don't like, don't make a big fuss about it. But this isn't just about Pompeo's clear lack of compassion. It's about his and conservatives' troubling hypocrisy on human rights. He postures as a Reagan-esque holy warrior for American freedom and democracy against tyranny abroad. Just not the Saudi tyranny that Pompeo indulged and rewarded in the form of billions of dollars in arms sales made against the will of Congress while freezing out investigators probing those deals. Now, Mike Pompeo might say, well, Saudi Arabia, the kingdom, is our ally. But how does he explain his cozying up to the North Korean tyranny? In his memoir, Pompeo now takes credit for helping forge the warm and fuzzy relationship, the love affair between Trump and Kim Jong-un, divulging that he, Pompeo, traveled to North Korea to start the dialogue in a secret 2018 meeting with Kim. And what about Afghanistan, where nearly 2,500 American troops died in the nation's longest war? Where was Pompeo on the draconian Taliban and its oppressive regime? As we've pointed out before, he was all over the place.
These are butchers. I met with them. I was in the room with them. It were some of the most difficult meetings for me personally and emotionally. I knew exactly who I was sitting across the table from. These are evil people.
I can't say much about what we've seen the Taliban do in the aftermath since, what are we now, a handful of days on, 5 days out. But we have seen the senior Taliban leadership working diligently to reduce violence from previous levels during similar time periods. And so we still have confidence that the Taliban leadership is working to deliver on its commitments.
Chris, we never trusted the Taliban. You can ask them yourselves. We made abundantly clear if they did not live up to that piece of paper, to the words that they had put on the ground, we weren't going to allow them to just walk away from any deal that they'd struck. We were going to go crush them.
There are a series of commitments that the Taliban have made. We have every expectation that they will follow through on them.
I hope they'll bring the air power. They should go crush these Taliban who are surrounding Kabul. We can do it with American air power. We should put pressure on them.
And apparently in a partnership still with al-Qaeda.
Nope, they said yesterday, signed a document, the gentleman I met with agreed that they would break that relationship and that they would work alongside of us to destroy, deny resources to, and have al-Qaeda depart from that place.
We've allowed the Chinese to castigate our senior leadership in Anchorage, and now we're allowing the Taliban to run free and wild all around Afghanistan.
Are they really living up to that commitment? It's our expectation. I met with them myself when I was in Doha. I looked them in the eye. They revalidated that commitment.
No, I'm not defensive at all.
It's true. Pompeo's concessions to the fanatical Taliban to end the war were so gross that even Bret Stephens, the hawkish and conservative New York Times opinion writer, called him the secretary of hypocrisy and said he'd own the catastrophe that may soon befall Afghanistan. Guess what? That catastrophe did hit Afghanistan. It's probably worth noting here that the title of Pompeo's new memoir is Never Give an Inch. Unless apparently you're sitting across from the Taliban in Doha, then you can give an inch or two, perhaps even a foot. But to be fair to Pompeo, his book is getting some big endorsements. Earlier this month at a GOP breakfast in Iowa, Republicans got a flyer with an ad praising the book. My new book reads like a thriller with stories from my heart, read the effusive blurb from one Mike Pompeo. Yeah, he blurbed his own book. I guess he couldn't get John Barron to do it. Pompeo is as shameless as Donald J. Trump, one of many qualities he shares with the ex-boss he now hopes to supplant in the White House. There's also the clear hatred that both of them hold for journalists.
Text messages show that diplomats under your authority told the Ukrainians that a good relationship with President Trump was only possible if they investigated his political opponent and theories about what happened in 2016. Were you aware that this was happening?
You know, again, you've got your facts wrong. Sounds like you're working, at least in part, for the Democratic National Committee.
Note, the reporter did not have her facts wrong, but that's never stopped Mike Pompeo from blasting reporters for reporting. Like when he got so mad in a 2020 interview with NPR host Mary Louise Kelly that he summoned her into his private office. As NPR reported on the incident, inside the room, Pompeo shouted his displeasure at being questioned about Ukraine and asked Kelly to identify the country on a map, which she did. Kelly says he then swore at her repeatedly and asked, "Do you think Americans care about Ukraine?" He then said, "People will hear about this." Yeah, they did hear about it, Mike. Also, I wonder if he ever asked his then boss to find Ukraine on a map. That would have been fun. Maybe, like Trump, Pompeo hates reporters because they keep asking him awkward questions about, you know, alleged corruption. Like those Madison dinners, a series of private taxpayer-funded soirees Pompeo held to, you know, vet billionaires, Republican politicians, people he needs for his career. They were first uncovered by NBC News. It's all very Trumpian behavior from a man who in 2016 warned that Donald Trump could not be president.
Donald Trump the other day said that, quote, if he tells a soldier to commit a war crime, the soldier will just go do it. He said, they'll do as I tell them to do. We've spent 7.5 years with an authoritarian president who ignored our Constitution. We don't need 4 more years of that.
Ooh, big talk, Mike. And yet almost 4 years later, Trump Secretary of State Mike Pompeo hadn't just changed his tune. This former West Point cadet had embraced the authoritarianism with both arms.
What's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses.
Hey, for once, Mike Pompeo wasn't even lying. Look, if Pompeo wants to beat Trump, he has to first contend with the way in which he is least like Trump. Because, you see, unlike the Donald, Pompeo is a total charisma-free zone. He evokes no stirring emotions. He has no connection with the little man. Look, the man has spent the past 6 years standing behind wood lecterns that are less wooden than he is. Outside of his hometown of Wichita, Kansas, his rallies would draw few fans beyond maybe Mrs. Pompeo. According to a Morning Consult poll of Republicans taken this week, Pompeo is a distant also-ran in the GOP presidential race, with 1% of the GOP votes, way behind Trump and DeSantis, and behind Mike Pence, and behind Nikki Haley, and behind Liz Cheney. He's even behind Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz has twice as much support as Mike Pompeo does. Well, at least all of the demagoguery, all the grifting, and all the attacking of journalists was worth it. Oh, and the quote-unquote lying, cheating, and stealing at the CIA. But that's where we are at the start of 2023. Even the least dynamic, least inspiring, and least likely GOP presidential contenders like Mike Pompeo are turning the far-right pandering up to 11. And not just far-right pandering, the awfulness, the crudeness, the meanness, going after a guy who was brutally murdered to get attention. Mike Pompeo, the man who blurbed his own book, will not be president. But his special brew of hypocrisy and brutality, sadly, that's the only future now for Pompeo's party. Joining me now is former Congressman Joe Walsh. He served along with Mike Pompeo in the House of Representatives. Joe has since left Congress and left the Republican Party. He's now host of the White Flag with Joe Walsh podcast. Also with us is Republican strategist and MSNBC political analyst Susan Del Percio. Thank you both for coming back on the show. Joe, let me start with you. Mike Pompeo claims to be a crusader for human rights. He then suggests Jamal Khashoggi, who, again, let me remind you all, dismembered by agents of the Saudi Crown Prince, he's no angel. And it's not just journalists he targets. In a tweet last November, he said the biggest threat to America, Joe, wasn't a foreign country or terrorist group. Quote, it's teachers' unions that push toxic wokeness on kids instead of teaching real American history, reading, and math. He's a ridiculous figure right now, is he not? Was he always this ridiculous when you served with him in the House?
No, Mehdi, Mike Pompeo was not always ridiculous, but like damn near everybody in my former party and like damn near everybody in right-wing media, he sold his soul to Donald Trump. Look, I know Pompeo. Pompeo's a smart guy. Look at the title of his book, Mehdi, Never Give an Inch. Pompeo knows that's not how you operate in politics or diplomacy. He wants to be the Republican nominee in 2024, period. That's why, and he's learned that to be the Republican Party nominee in this Republican Party, if you're not Trump, you have to be like Trump, and namely, you have to be cruel. Mehdi, I'm so glad you emphasized that in your lead. My former political party now boasts of how cruel they are. Bullies. That's what Pompeo is trying to be. He's got two problems, though, Mehdi. He sold his soul to Donald Trump. He's not Trump. And he's got to run away from the Trump record, which was not tough when it came to authoritarians.
No. Susan, Mike Pompeo is being coy right now about a possible presidential run, but he's out with that memoir that takes semi-pot shots at other hopefuls, not just Trump, but Pence and Nikki Haley. This is a guy who's pulling 1% in the polls, less than the margin of error. What animates mediocre men like Mike Pompeo to throw their hat in every big race? What is he thinking here?
I don't know. I was really trying to think hard about who his constituency could be, and there is none. I mean, even when he was looking to run for U.S. Senate back in 2020 from Kansas, he didn't have the personality or the charisma for Kansas. I don't see him bringing it to the presidential field. And frankly, until your introduction, I really thought of Mike Pompeo as one of the more forgettable members of the Trump administration, except for all the awful things that he's done. So this book is a combination of reputation rehab sometimes, but it's also a way of getting your name out there. He takes pop shots at others because it's the only way we'll talk about him on days like today.
He's not charismatic enough for Kansas would make a great bumper sticker. Joe, go on.
No, Mehdi, here's what Pompeo thinks. Look, if Trump isn't the nominee, and I still believe this is Trump's party and the nomination is his, but if Trump's not the guy, Pompeo, Pence, Cruz, Haley, they all rightly know that DeSantis is weak. DeSantis will be a horrible candidate once people get to know him. So Pompeo's play, like Pence's and Cruz's and all the rest is, if Trump's out of the picture, they can beat DeSantis. That's what Pompeo believes.
Yeah, although I think DeSantis is a weak candidate against Trump. I'm not sure he's a weak candidate against some of the people you mentioned. I would argue that I have more chance of being the GOP presidential nominee in 2024 than Mike's Pompeo and Pence. Joe, just one important point before I go back to Susan. We haven't talked that much, people haven't talked that much about Mike Pompeo's Christian nationalism, something he did have when he was in Congress with you. He's always talked about, this clash of the Christian West and the Islamic East. He's always portrayed himself as some kind of holy warrior when he spoke at churches during his time as a Kansas congressman. I got to ask, it's kind of dangerous to have someone like this guy, like 20 years after the Bush-Cheney era. This is Dr. Strangelove bumbling in from a Tom Clancy novel or whatever. Go back to Susan's point. What's his constituency? Is it kind of the neocons? Is it the old-fashioned let's bomb Muslim countries? Is that his constituency, Joe?
Yeah, Mehdi, Pompeo has always had this. He's always led and been very public with his Christian religion. And he's always been very forward in leaning into that as an elected official. You know, a lot of people make fun of Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert because they talk about making America a Christian theocracy and how abhorrent that is to the very notion of America. But Mehdi, Pompeo believes in the same thing. He just doesn't come across as a nut like Lauren Boebert.
Yeah, good point. Susan, as Joe pointed out, Mike Pompeo, like many others, sold his soul to Donald Trump. He never stood up to Trump in office. His book doesn't really stand up to Trump. I wonder, how is it possible for any of these GOP hopefuls to beat Trump without standing up to him, without calling him out? None of them have. Not Pence, not Haley, not DeSantis, who's had every opportunity. How do you beat Trump without, you know, he's been in a very weak position. You are a political strategist. Would you not be telling your client, the guy's on the ropes, finish him?
Well, here's the thing. Some of the people you mentioned worked for Donald Trump. Those who worked for Donald Trump, like Pompeo or Haley, or in some regard Mike Pence, they'll never be able to break away from Trump to go after Trump enough to go against him in a primary and come out at all successful. DeSantis is a little different. DeSantis just hasn't taken the bait yet. He has not engaged Trump where Trump can be the weakest, which is on his baggage and basically representing the past. All of the people who worked for Trump, who are thinking about running, represent the past. No one wants to be there anymore. And especially when it comes to like a Mike Pompeo, the neocons, even Trump's base is not a neocon base. So these folks really have nowhere to go. Maybe Nikki Haley, but that's about it.
And Susan, just speaking of not standing up to Trump, just sticking with that issue, right after January the 6th, 3 sources told CNBC that Pompeo was one of a small number of cabinet members who did discuss using the 25th Amendment to remove Trump from office. Not only did he not go through with that, but now, 2 years later in his book, Pompeo is denying those reports. Here was a chance to put some daylight between himself and Trump, and as cravenly as ever, he turns it down, Susan.
Yeah, but it doesn't work to put daylight between yourself and Donald Trump if that's all you have to run on is your work as Secretary of State with Donald Trump. So that's not going to play well. But again, I think when you look at the policies, and your intro, by the way, Manny, was fantastic. I mean, all anyone needs to do is run that, and basically I don't think Pompeo gets anywhere anytime soon. And his book sales just go out of the waters, because that was a great intro to the topic.
Thank you very much. I will pass that on to our team, where we put it all together. Joe, one last question to you. In his book, Pompeo relates that 2018 meeting with Kim Jong-un and claims that he told Kim to his face, quote, "I'm still trying to kill you." Elsewhere in the book, Pompeo claims he was such a thorn in the Chinese government side, in Xi Jinping's side, that Trump told him to, quote, "shut the hell up" about China and Xi. Isn't it amazing how all these Mike Pompeo stories, Joe, end with Mike Pompeo sounding really tough on dictators who are afraid of him? Isn't that very convenient?
Very convenient, and I don't believe any of it, Mehdi. And to your earlier question, why can't or won't any of these Republicans criticize or go after Trump? They can't, because this is a Trumpy party now. If the nominee's not going to be Trump, the nominee is going to be the Trumpiest person out there, because that's where the voters are. Pompeo knows that.
Part of me is looking forward to Mike Pompeo running for president and then getting battered. I'll get my popcorn. Joe Walsh and Susan Del Percio, as ever, always a pleasure. Thank you for your time.